A life spent dancing on the edges of brilliance and chaos, where laughter masks the tremors of fear, and every smile hides a secret. At 73, Jeff Goldblum sits alone in a quiet room, the walls lined with decades of photographs. Frozen smiles of co-stars, snapshots of red carpets, fragments of a Hollywood life that seems almost mythic. And yet, behind those eyes, there's a truth he has carried quietly for years. A truth about Rob Reiner, a man whose shadow looms over his own story in ways the public could never imagine. Tonight, he decides to speak. Not for fame, not for headlines, but for release, for the exorcism of ghosts that have haunted him since the golden age of celluloid dreams collided with human frailty. He begins slowly, as if each word is a fragile thread he fears may snap. The story starts with laughter, of course. Rob, exuberant, commanding, a director whose name alone could elevate a film and a legend, would throw parties that felt like the pulse of Hollywood itself. Goldblum remembers the first night they met, a glamorous, chaotic mix of glittering stars and whispered rivalries. There was Meryl Streep across the room, elegantly detached, her sharp gaze cutting through the noise. There was Billy Crystal, cracking jokes that made the room shake with laughter. And there was Jeff, a young actor with a curiosity that bordered on obsession, fascinated by every movement of Reiner, trying to decode the man behind the myth. But soon, the glamour dissolved into something far more complicated. The calls, once casual and playful, became pointed. Meetings were postponed with excuses that didn't add up. Rob Reiner, the man who could charm entire studios into greenlighting impossible projects, began to demand a loyalty that Jeff had never promised. And then came the whispers, small, almost imperceptible, that something in Reiner's world had shifted. Colleagues fell still, and around certain topics. Friends hesitated before mentioning names. It was as though the air itself thickened with unsaid things, as if Hollywood had erected invisible walls to protect a secret that Jeff was only beginning to sense. Goldblum recounts a pivotal evening, a dinner that would haunt him for years. The table was crowded with actors he admired, directors whose reputations were untouchable, and yet beneath the surface, tension pulsed like a heartbeat in the shadows. Rob leaned forward, his voice low but commanding, and spoke of choices, moral, artistic, personal, that made Jeff pause in a way he had never paused before. There was a subtext, a hidden agenda, a subtle power play that Jeff did not fully understand at the time. And yet, refusing to comply, refusing to perform the ritual that seemed unspoken yet mandatory, carried cost. He felt it immediately, a coldness creeping through every interaction after that night, a shift in the universe that only decades later he would begin to name. The story deepens when illness enters the frame. Jeff speaks quietly, almost ashamed, of his own moments of vulnerability, the nights of insomnia, the unexplained fevers, the sudden tremor of hands that once moved with a musician's grace. And always, lurking at the edge of his mind, was Reiner's shadow, a man who seemed to thrive on precision, on control, on extracting confessions without words. It was in these quiet, lonely moments, when the city slept and the screen of memory flickered, that Jeff realized the true cost of proximity to genius. It could demand everything from you, including your peace, your clarity, and at times, your family. Family, he confesses with a voice breaking, was the hardest. There were missed birthdays, forgotten holidays, silent dinners where his children wondered at his absence, at the distance that seemed to grow between them. His partner, her patient, absorbed the tension, carrying a burden Jeff could not articulate. The irony was cruel. The world saw a man alive with charisma, effortlessly charming, but behind the curtain, there was guilt, there was regret, there was the sharp ache of choices that had stolen from him the simplest joys. And all of it, he whispers, somehow tangled with Rob Reiner, that he pauses, and in that pause is a lifetime. The laughter, the applause, the bright lights of Hollywood juxtaposed with hidden truths, betrayals, and unspoken words. Jeff Goldblum's hands shake slightly as he recounts the first moment he understood the depth of the secret he has carried. A private conversation, one that Rob would never repeat, about loyalty, betrayal, and the invisible costs of fame. A moment that changed the trajectory of his life, quietly but irrevocably, leaving him to wrestle with the shadow of another man even as he built his own legend. The memory comes back in fragments, like flickering film reels, snapshots of a life both luminous and bruised. Jeff Goldblum's voice softens as he describes the first time he truly confronted Rob Reiner. Not in public, not under the bright glare of cameras, but alone, in a quiet office backstage from a premiere. Reiner was poised, his presence commanding as ever. But there was an edge now, a tension that Jeff could almost touch. Words were exchanged, polite on the surface, but heavy with implication. Reiner's piercing eyes seemed to probe for weaknesses, for loyalties unspoken. Jeff remembers the exact phrase that chilled him. Some truths are easier to live with when left unsaid. At the time, it sounded almost cryptic, a director's dramatics, but the weight of it settled deep into him, a seed of unease that would grow over decades. The following months were a careful dance. Goldblum found himself navigating the labyrinthine corridors of Hollywood politics with heightened caution. Every audition, every offer carried the invisible shadow of Reiner's judgment. Collaborators whispered advice. Colleagues hinted at alliances and betrayals he had yet to see. It was during the filming of a small independent project, far from the glare of studio lights, that Jeff first felt the real human cost of these unseen battles. He recalls nights when he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by doubt and fear. Not fear for his life, not fear for fame, but fear for the fragile bonds of trust and love that had always grounded him. Family dinners missed, phone calls ignored, a child's laughter he could only hear in memory. These became the collateral damage of navigating a world dominated by a man whose genius was matched only by his capacity for control, and then tragedy struck in ways that no rehearsal could prepare him for. A close friend, an actor he had worked with for years, succumbed to a sudden illness, a cruel reminder of mortality. Jeff recounts the grief in vivid, painful detail. The hospital room, the sterile scent, the last words whispered from a friend who had shared both laughter and secrets. He cried alone, something rare for a man whose public persona had always been magnetic, vibrant, unstoppable. The weight of this death, coupled with the unresolved tension with Reiner, pressed upon him like a storm he could neither escape nor predict. It was a moment that crystallized the understanding. Life is finite, and secrets, even those buried in admiration and fear, can be heavier than any role ever written. Goldblum's recollection drifts to the subtle betrayals, the almost invisible cracks in relationships, both personal and professional. He speaks, almost in a whisper, of colleagues who had smiled while plotting behind his back, of agents who promised loyalty but delivered compliance to Reiner's unseen will. The world outside might have seen a confident, quirky actor with the charm of a jazz mellow. DY, but inside, he felt the quiet erosion of autonomy. Every choice became a negotiation, every conversation a potential minefield. He remembers confiding in a mentor, a legendary Hollywood figure whose name he now cannot speak aloud, about the pressure, the fear, the gnawing sense of being both celebrated and surveilled. The advice was simple, devastatingly honest. In this world, Jeff, genius and cruelty often arrive together. Even the bright moments were tinged with melancholy. Awards nights, premieres, and late-night jazz sessions in Los Angeles clubs brought temporary reprieve, fleeting glimpses of joy, but always with an awareness of cost. He remembers sitting with friends, actors and directors he admired, laughing under dim lights, the music soft, the night warm, all the while feeling the invisible strings that tied him to decisions he hadn't wanted to make. Rob Reiner's influence, subtle yet unrelenting, threaded through the highs and lows, reminding him that even brilliance carries a price, and that some debts are not financial but emotional, intimate, and lifelong. And then there were the breakdowns, moments Jeff describes with a rare and piercing vulnerability. A hotel room in New York, a solitary rehearsal space in Los Angeles, a quiet garden in Paris. Places where he allowed himself to unravel, to speak aloud the fears and regrets that had accumulated for decades. Tears came easily, trembling hands, the voice breaking as he revisited confrontations, missed opportunities, words spoken and unspoken. It was in those moments, he reveals, that he began to understand the human cost of genius. It does not merely shine. It casts long, inescapable shadows, and sometimes those shadows fall on those who admire it most. And yet, in the midst of this turbulence, there were moments of startling clarity, fleeting, almost painful in their beauty. Jeff Goldblum remembers one rainy afternoon in Los Angeles, walking through the empty streets after a late rehearsal, the city slick with reflection. He thought about Rob Reiner, not as a director, not as a legend, but as a man whose influence had shaped the trajectory of his life in ways both visible and unseen. There was anger, yes, and disappointment, but also a strange gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunities, for the encounters, for the lessons learned in the crucible of Hollywood ambition. But that gratitude was complicated, tangled with the ache of personal cost. Missed birthdays, broken friendships, and a quiet, gnawing regret that sometimes whispered that he had paid too high a price for the privilege of proximity to greatness. The story grows darker when Jeff recounts the incident that, for decades, he had carried like a secret wound. A night in a Los Angeles hotel suite, after a screening of a film that had been a critical triumph, where Reiner's words, measured, deliberate, and chilling, cut through the celebration. "The world only rewards those who bend," Reiner said. And bending isn't weakness, it's survival. Jeff remembers the knot in his stomach, the cold sweat, the sudden awareness that in this world, brilliance demanded compromise, sometimes of the soul itself. That night, he walked alone to the balcony. The city sprawled beneath him like a glittering battlefield, and whispered to no one in particular the things he had never admitted. The fear, the doubt, the hidden resentment that had quietly grown. Family continued to bear the silent weight. Goldblum recalls the soft, reproachful eyes of his children, the tender disappointment of his partner, and the private sorrow that comes when your presence is a luxury rather than a given. He remembers phone calls left unanswered, school recitals missed, quiet nights where laughter should have filled the rooms, but only echoes remained. In those moments, he realized that fame is not merely a spotlight. It is a mirror reflecting every flaw, every lapse, every sacrifice that has been made. And behind that mirror, he knew, was Reiner's presence, subtle yet inescapable, shaping the narrative of both his triumphs and his absences. The turning point, he admits, came not on a set, nor at a party, but in a hospital room. A fellow actor, one whose career had intersected with both him and Reiner's, lay gravely ill. The quiet beeping of monitors became a backdrop to confessions, regrets, and revelations. Jeff sat at the bedside, holding a hand that had once been a collaborator, a friend, and he realized the fragility of life, of relationships, and of the truths left unsaid. There was a whispered apology, an acknowledgement of the unseen pressures that Hollywood imposes, and the quiet understanding that some mistakes, some silences, can never be undone. Even as the years passed, Jeff describes the lingering effects of these experiences, the tremor in his hands, the sudden bouts of insomnia, the way a single glance or a casual comment can transport him back to that mixture of awe and fear he felt in Reiner's presence. He speaks of other Hollywood figures, Meryl Streep, Tom Hanks, and a few others whose names hover like protective talismans, who have witnessed these dynamics, but whose interventions were limited, constrained by the same invisible structures that govern the entire ecosystem. It was a world of brilliance shadowed by consequence, where talent and fear coexisted in a delicate, often cruel equilibrium. And beneath it all lies the human heart, raw and unvarnished. Goldblum's voice falters as he recounts the nights of tears alone, of journals filled with thoughts too complex for conversation, of music played on an upright piano that only he could hear, each note a confession, each chord plea. He speaks of grief, regret, longing, and the quiet, persistent hope that by speaking now, finally, he might unburden himself, that by revealing the truth about his IME with Rob Reiner, he might reclaim a fragment of the peace Hollywood had so long denied him. The weight of unspoken words clung to him like a second skin. Jeff Goldblum recalls a winter in New York, sitting alone in a dimly lit jazz club, the piano's low notes vibrating through the room, carrying a melancholy that matched his own. He thought of all the moments he had silenced himself, the times he had swallowed discomfort to preserve appearances, to honor the invisible hierarchy that Reiner's genius and reputation commanded. The city outside hummed with life, indifferent to the private turmoil of a man who, to the world, seemed untouchable, eternal, and effortlessly charming. But inside, Jeff felt a quiet unraveling, a sense that every laugh, every eccentric performance, carried the shadow of compromise he could never fully escape. He remembers one particular evening when the private truths he had carried collided with public expectation. A press event for a critically acclaimed film, where reporters, unaware of the hidden currents, pressed for insight into the collaboration with Reiner. Jeff felt the familiar knot tighten in his chest. There were stories he could tell, anecdotes that might thrill the audience, but the deeper truth, the fractures, the manipulation, the emotional toll, had to remain buried. He smiled, joked, delivered charm with precision, but inside, a storm raged. That night, in the solitude of his hotel room, he wept quietly, mourning not only the cost of silence, but the cost of life itself. Lived partially in shadows to preserve appearances. Then came the confrontation that would forever define his understanding of both Reiner and himself. On the set of a project that was to be a defining moment for both men, a disagreement spiraled in a tension so thick it could almost be felt by the crew. Rob, commanding, precise, and unyielding, challenged Jeff in front of others, testing boundaries, probing weaknesses. Goldblum felt the familiar mix of awe and fear, but something had shifted. There was no fear left to paralyze him, only clarity. He realized, in that charged moment, that the power of one man's genius could not determine the value of his own life, his own choices, or his own integrity. Yet the encounter left scars, invisible but real, etched into his psyche like a permanent film of light and shadow. The story intertwines with loss, a recurring motif in Jeff's confessions. Friends, colleagues, mentors, some gone too soon, others estranged. Each departure carved spaces of grief he carried silently. He recalls a legendary actor, a friend and mentor, whose passing left an emptiness he could not fill. The hospital visits, the whispered goodbyes, the impossibility of reversing time. These were lessons in mortality and humility that he had learned too late, often in isolation. And always, lurking at the edge of memory, was the specter of Reiner, whose choices, both direct and indirect, had rippled outward, affecting more than just careers, shaping personal lives in ways invisible to the public eye. Jeff speaks with rare candor about regret, the moments that haunt a man when the cameras are off and the applause fades. There were opportunities missed, relationships strained, moments when his own instincts had been overridden by the weight of another's vision. He confesses, with trembling honesty, the nights spent writing letters never sent, the hours spent in confessional solitude, the struggle to reconcile admiration with disappointment. Each memory is layered, a mosaic of brilliance tinged with sorrow, of laughter intertwined with pain, of a life spent negotiating the delicate balance between loyalty and self-preservation. And yet, through it all, there is AF. Fragile, persistent hope. Goldblum's voice, though weary, carries the quiet strength of survival. He speaks of a decision to finally share these truths, not to condemn, but to illuminate, to unburden, to make sense of a labyrinthine past. There's a haunting beauty in the act of confession, a slow exhalation of decades of tension, a letting go of the ghosts that have lingered too long. He looks directly into the memory of the camera, or perhaps into the hearts of those who will listen. and admits that the path has been neither simple nor fair. But it has been his. There is a quiet intensity in Jeff Goldblum's recollection of the years that followed, a tension between public triumph and private turmoil, even as he appeared on screens around the world. Effortlessly eccentric, magnetic, undeniably alive, he carried the residue of choices and compromises made under the weight of Reiner's influence. He speaks of a film festival in Venice, a gala in Cannes, the applause and accolades that should have been pure joy, but which felt tempered by the silent ledger of debts and unspoken truths. Every handshake, every toast, every photo was a reminder that Hollywood brilliance can be both intoxicating and suffocating, and that the cost of proximity to genius is rarely measured in money or awards. It is measured in lost moments, fractured relationships, and the subtle erosion of self that he pauses, eyes distant, recalling a dinner in Beverly Hills with a constellation of actors, Meryl Streep, Tom Hanks, Diane Keaton, where laughter echoed across a candlelit room, and yet, beneath the gaiety, tension simmered. Reiner was there, commanding as ever, and Jeff found himself caught between admiration and caution, compelled to navigate invisible lines drawn long ago. The conversation touched on morality, artistry, and the fragile interplay of personal ambition and loyalty. And in that charged atmosphere, Jeff realized that Hollywood was more than a stage. It was a crucible, and survival required not just talent, but a careful, sometimes painful diplomacy, a willingness to bend without breaking, and a courage to preserve one's humanity amidst the shadows of others' control. Illness and mortality remained ever-present threads. Jeff recounts the moment he received news that a beloved co-star and mentor had fallen gravely ill, a man whose presence had been a stabilizing force, whose laughter had lightened the darkest sets. The grief hit with raw, unrelenting force, compounded by the awareness that time is finite and choices irreversible. Alone in his hotel room, Jeff allowed himself to grieve openly, a rare concession in a life otherwise dictated by the gaze of the world. He describes the hospital room in vivid detail, the sterile scent, the quiet beeping of monitors, the frailty of the human body juxtaposed against the enduring power of memory and friendship. In that moment, the magnitude of Hollywood's hidden toll became undeniable. Friendships strained, opportunities deferred, and the invisible weight of expectation pressing down relentlessly. He tells of confrontations that never made headlines, conversations behind closed doors, moments when Reiner's sharp intellect and unyielding will collided with Jeff's own sense of morality and integrity. There were heated arguments, subtle manipulations, and quiet tests of loyalty that left him exhausted, questioning not only others but himself. Goldblum reflects on the peculiar paradox of admiration and resentment, how one can revere a person's genius while simultaneously grieving the personal cost it imposes. Every decision, every negotiation, every unspoken compromise carried consequences that extended far beyond the set. Ting families, friendships, and the fragile scaffolding of trust that supports human connection. And yet, amidst the tension, there were moments of unexpected grace. Goldblum recalls nights in dimly lit jazz clubs, the soft strains of a piano offering refuge, where he could lose himself in music, in improvisation, in the rhythm of something purely his own. These were the islands of freedom in a life otherwise governed by external pressures, the rare spaces where he could breathe without calculation, speak without fear, and feel without compromise. They were also the crucibles in which he found resilience, the quiet acknowledgement that while the shadows of others may loom large, the human spirit retains the capacity for renewal and self-expression. Family remained both anchor and casualty. Jeff speaks of the quiet ache of missed milestones, of children's questions unanswered, of partners bearing burdens in silence. The weight of expectation and the lure of opportunity had exacted their toll, leaving scars that were invisible to the world but felt profoundly in the home. And always the memory of Reiner hovered, not as an antagonist, not as a villain, but as a force whose brilliance demanded tribute and whose presence shaped choices in ways both subtle and profound. Jeff's confessions carry the heavy cadence of regret, but also the fragile glow of understanding. That love, loyalty, ambition, and genius are intertwined in ways that are never simple, and that life, even amidst shadows, is worth speaking into the quiet night. The years pressed on, each one layering memory upon memory, triumph upon quiet torment. Jeff Goldblum reflects on a period in the early 2000s when his career reached a surreal apex. Films lauded worldwide, invitations to events he once only dreamed of, encounters with legends of cinema. And yet, the very success that should have brought joy often felt like a mirror, reflecting both his accomplishments and the subtle toll exacted by Rob Reiner's influence. He recalls the subtle manipulations, the ways Reiner could, with a glance or a phrase, shift the dynamics of a set, a studio, a life. Jeff learned early that brilliance is intoxicating, but it can also be binding, and even admiration carries a hidden price. He recounts private dinners in Los Angeles, evenings meant to celebrate achievement, that often became exercises in subtle negotiation. Conversations with co-stars and producers danced around invisible boundaries, unspoken rules, tests of loyalty. Goldblum remembers the weight of each word, the careful modulation of tone, the constant mental tally of what could be said and what had to remain silent. There was a moment, he admits, when he realized the truth he had carried all along. The very brilliance that inspired him could also control him, and the choices of others, especially Reiner, rippled into the quietest corners of his personal life. Illness and mortality continued to intrude. Jeff recalls a particularly haunting experience. A close friend and collaborator, someone whose laughter had once filled sets and hotel suites, was suddenly taken by a swift illness. Jeff sat by the bedside, watching the subtle rise and fall of a chest that had once been vigorous, feeling the raw pang of helplessness. In that sterile hospital room, grief mixed with anger and fear, a cocktail he would carry for years. He reflects, almost with awe, on the cruelty of timing, how life can demand the reckoning of emotions while the world remains indifferent, continuing its relentless spin. The confessions grow intimate, almost unbearably so. Jeff speaks of nights spent alone in darkened hotel rooms, playing soft piano melodies, writing in journals never meant to be read, confronting the silent weight of decisions made and paths taken. He reveals the quiet suffering of family left waiting, of birthdays and anniversaries missed, of moments that cannot be reclaimed. And always, lurking at the edges of memory, is Rob Reiner, sometimes a shadow, sometimes a ghost, sometimes a force that forced confrontation with both self and circumstance. Jeff's vulnerability is palpable. The confessions feel like whispers in a cathedral, private, sacred, and trembling with emotion. There were also moments of reckoning on set, rare confrontations where the tension became undeniable. He recalls a day when Reiner's exacting presence tested him to the limit, probing, demanding, analyzing. Jeff felt the familiar mixture of fear and respect, but in that moment, something shifted. He realized that survival in Hollywood did not require surrender, but courage. The courage to assert boundaries, to honor integrity, and to navigate genius without losing oneself entirely. It was a lesson learned slowly, painfully, through decades of subtle manipulation, near misses, and private reckonings. And then, finally, there was the decision to speak. The choice to reveal these truths, not as indictment, but as illumination. Goldblum's voice, though heavy with years of memory, carries a sense of release. He admits that the story of Rob Reiner, of Hollywood, of friendship, and of compromise is not simple, and never could be. Yet in sharing it, in letting the shadows speak, he finds a fragile redemption, the acknowledgement that brilliance, love, grief, regret, and loyalty can coexist, tangled and messy, but still profoundly human. There is a quiet dignity in this confession, a slow exhale of decades of tension, a step toward understanding and perhaps toward peace. And yet, even as Jeff Goldblum speaks of release, the weight of the past lingers like a soft echo in an empty theater. He recalls a late night in Paris, walking along the Seine after a screening of one of his most celebrated films. The city was alive with light and laughter, but for him, each reflection in the water carried a memory of lost friends, of conversations left incomplete, of opportunities deferred or altered by the quiet yet persistent influence of Rob Reiner. He thought about all the ways life's course can be redirected by another person's brilliance, by the gravity of genius that commands attention, admiration, and sometimes compliance. It is a lesson learned in whispers and shadows, a lesson he wishes he had understood sooner, yet one he could never undo. Family remained the center of his emotional universe, even when the demands of fame pulled him away. Goldblum recounts tender moments. A child's laughter across a dinner table he had almost missed, a quiet conversation with a partner who had carried burdens in silence, the soft resilience of love that had endured despite distance and distraction. These memories, though sometimes tinged with regret, became anchors. They reminded him that while Hollywood could exact its toll, while brilliance could manipulate and control, the heart remained capable of connection, forgiveness, and renewal. The shadows of Reiner's influence are never far. Jeff describes an encounter at a retrospective screening of a classic film, a moment when both men were present, the room charged with unspoken tension. Reiner's presence was magnetic, commanding, almost theatrical in its intensity. Jeff felt the familiar mixture of respect, fear, and something more complicated, an understanding of the costs, the compromises, the unseen debts owed to genius. Yet in that moment, he also felt a measure of liberation. He had endured, he had survived, and he could now reflect without the immediacy of manipulation, without the pressure to perform under someone else's shadow. Regret, of course, remains a constant companion. He speaks of projects he turned down, of words unsaid, of the small, quiet betrayals we commit against ourselves in the pursuit of survival. There are nights when he still replays moments in his mind, choices that, in retrospect, feel both necessary and painful. He confesses, with remarkable honesty, that these regrets are not simply about career, but about life itself. The missed moments, the quiet sacrifices, the personal losses interwoven with public achievement. And yet, in naming them, in acknowledging them, there's a subtle catharsis, a slow, deliberate confrontation with the past that brings clarity, even if not absolution, that in the quiet moments, when the cameras are off and the applause has faded, Jeff allows himself to fully feel the complexity of his journey. He recalls nights of improvisation on piano, the cathartic solitude of music, the letters never sent, the conversations never had, the tears shed in private rooms. These are the hidden textures of his life, the unpolished, human moments that Hollywood never documents, but that shape the soul. And through it all, there's a recognition. The interplay of genius and fear, of loyalty and compromise, of love and loss, has defined not only his career, but his very being as he reflects on decades of laughter, heartbreak, and revelation. Jeff Goldblum's voice carries the weight of lived experience, tempered by the slow wisdom of age. He speaks of endings, not as absolution, but as understanding, a recognition that while shadows may linger, the act of confession itself is a light. And as he leans back, hands trembling slightly over the piano keys, there is a fragile serenity, a quiet acknowledgement that life, in all its complexity, is a story worth telling, even when the truth is difficult, even when the past is heavy, and even when the heart bears scars that never fully fade. The years had a way of crystallizing memory, of sharpening the contours of joy and regret alike. Jeff Goldblum recalls a chilly evening in New York, sitting alone in his apartment with a record spinning softly in the background, rain streaking the window like liquid silver. He thought of Rob Reiner, Not the public figure, not the brilliant director whose name could command a studio, but the man whose choices, small and large, had threaded through his life in ways both subtle and profound. There was admiration, yes, and still a complicated ache, the feeling that every triumph had been tempered by invisible pressures, every smile shadowed by unspoken tests of loyalty. He understood, finally, that the story of his life could never be told without acknowledging the profound impact of this one presence. He recounts the loneliness of fame, of being constantly observed yet rarely understood. Hollywood applauded eccentricity, celebrated quirk, demanded charm, but rarely accounted for the private cost. The hours spent negotiating invisible hierarchies, the fear of misstep, the burden of expectation. Jeff speaks candidly of the nights spent in dimly lit rehearsal rooms, playing piano to the rhythm of his own thoughts, the music of balm, a confessional, a lifeline. These were the spaces where he could breathe without fear, speak without calculation, and confront the human truth behind the public persona. And yet, even in these sanctuaries, the shadow of Reiner's influence lingered, a quiet reminder of the complex interplay between admiration, fear, and survival. Family continued to offer both solace and responsibility. Jeff reflects on the delicate balance of maintaining relationships while navigating a career that demanded relentless energy and attention. He speaks of whispered conversations with children, tender reconciliations with a partner who had borne the invisible burden, alongside him, and the ongoing effort to repair the small fractures caused by absence and preoccupation. There is both regret and hope in these reflections, a recognition that while the past cannot be rewritten, the present offers opportunities to restore connection, to honor love, and to rebuild trust that had been stretched thin by decades of compromise. He recalls moments of confrontation with Reiner that, though rare, left an indelible mark. On the set of a major project, a disagreement escalated into tension palpable to the entire crew. Reiner's brilliance was undeniable, his intensity magnetic, but Jeff realized that he could navigate the encounter without surrendering his own integrity. It was a lesson earned through decades of subtle manipulation, missed opportunities, and private reckonings. Genius demands recognition, but does not demand the erosion of one's soul. In that moment, he felt both fear and liberation, the strange duality of acknowledging the power of another while reclaiming the sovereignty of self. Illness and mortality remained ever-present shadows. Jeff remembers attending hospital rooms, whispering final words to colleagues and friends whose lives had intersected with both his and Reiner's. Each farewell reinforced the fragility of existence, the fleeting nature of opportunity, and the importance of speaking truth while one still can. The weight of these losses deepened his understanding of the costs, both visible and invisible, of life in the orbit of brilliance. He recognized, in quiet moments of grief, that loyalty, love, and survival are intertwined in ways both beautiful and tragic, often leaving scars that are invisible but deeply felt. And so, at 73, Jeff Goldblum finally chooses to speak, not to accuse, not to condemn, but to illuminate, to unburden, to honor the complexity of a life lived in the dazzling yet demanding glare of Hollywood. He shares his regrets, his grief, his moments of fear and courage, the hidden truths of relationships strained and sustained, the small acts of rebellion, the quiet reconciliations, the deep, enduring love of family and friends. In telling this story, he finds not absolution but clarity, a chance to understand, to reflect, and to acknowledge that life, in all its brilliance and shadow, is a story worth telling, even when the truths are difficult, even when the past weighs heavily, and even when the heart bears scars that never fully fade. There's a stillness in Jeff Goldblum's confession now, a deliberate pause that carries decades of memory and emotion. He recalls one of the quietest moments of reckoning, a late night in Los Angeles. After a screening had ended, the theater empty except for the cleaning staff. The applause and flashing lights of earlier hours had faded, leaving only the echo of footsteps in the lobby. In that emptiness, he allowed himself to confront the full spectrum of his experiences with Rob Reiner. The admiration, the fear, the unspoken pressures, the subtle manipulations, and the profound, sometimes painful lessons learned. He realized, in that silence, that Hollywood brilliance is never merely light. It casts long, inescapable shadows, and those who live within them carry marks that are both visible and invisible. Family, he confesses, was both a refuge and a reminder of cost. He recounts intimate moments of connection, a child's tentative questions about absence, a partner's quiet understanding, the warmth of laughter in a home sometimes hollowed by his own choices. And yet, he acknowledges the fractures too, the birthdays missed, the the truths that define him as much as his public persona. And within these reflections, he recognizes a fragile beauty, the coexistence of admiration and fear, of regret and resilience, of loss and connection, all forming the mosaic of a life lived fully, if not without pain. Finally, there's a sense of release, a subtle exhalation after decades of carrying shadows. Jeff speaks not to indict, not to accuse, but to illuminate the intricate, sometimes tragic, sometimes beautiful dynamics of a life spent within the orbit of genius. He acknowledges the complexity of Rob Reiner's influence, its brilliance, its demands, its consequences, while reclaiming the sovereignty of his own story. In doing so, he finds clarity, understanding, and a quiet dignity. The recognition that life, in all its contradictions, is worth confronting, worth sharing, and worth honoring, even when the truths are heavy, even when the past is haunting, and even when the heart bears scars that will never fully fade. And now, the story begins to fold in on itself, the past and present intertwining in a tapestry of memory, regret, and revelation. Jeff Goldblum recalls a particular afternoon in Los Angeles, long after the cameras had stopped rolling and the industry buzz had faded. He was sitting on the steps outside a quiet theater, watching children play in the courtyard below, sunlight scattering across the worn pavement. In that serene moment, he felt the weight of everything. The glory, the mistakes, the manipulations, the heartbreaks, the rare triumphs. Rob Reiner's presence, though invisible in that moment, lingered in memory, in lessons learned, in challenges faced, in the subtle shaping of a life spent in proximity to brilliance. It was a mixture of reverence, resentment, and ultimately understanding, of a recognition that genius leaves marks, both painful and instructive, family and love. He reflected. CTS became the anchor amid the turbulence. He remembers quiet nights with his children, stories told under dim lamplight, laughter shared in fleeting windows of time that were his own. There were apologies whispered softly, moments of repair, the gentle acknowledgement that while some moments are lost forever, others can still be claimed. Jeff's partner, ever patient, had borne witness to decades of strain, compromise, and occasional triumph, and it was through these private bonds that he discovered resilience, grounding, and a sense of continuity beyond the glare of fame. These intimate recollections carry both warmth and sorrow. The bittersweet awareness that life's most precious truths often exist in the spaces between public acclaim and private struggle. The specter of Reiner remains present, a shadow cast across decades of interaction. Jeff recalls subtle tensions on film sets, private conversations charged with unspoken expectation, moments when loyalty and judgment collided. Reiner's brilliance was undeniable, his presence magnetic, yet Jeff learned to navigate the currents without surrendering his own voice. He recounts the precise lessons: patience, discernment, courage. In these confrontations, he discovered that survival in the orbit of genius does not demand obedience, but a careful negotiation of integrity, creativity, and human connection. It is a lesson learned slowly, painfully, but indelibly, shaping not only his career, but his approach to life itself. Grief and mortality continue to shape the narrative. Friends, colleagues, and mentors fell ill, passed away, leaving emptiness, reflection, and the realization that life is finite, that moments are fleeting, and that regret is best faced before it calcifies. Jeff describes whispered farewells in hospital rooms, the stark quiet of loss, the profound weight of absence. Each encounter sharpened his awareness of time, deepened his understanding of consequence, and reinforced the fragile beauty of human connection. In these experiences, he glimpsed the inescapable truth that life, in all its brilliance and cruelty, is defined as much by love and presence as by talent and fame. And yet, even amid reflection and sorrow, there is hope. Jeff's confession is not merely a recounting of hardship, but a meditation on resilience. Nights at the piano, solitary walks through empty theaters, letters never sent. These small acts of self-expression became lifelines, offering clarity, grounding, and a quiet reclamation of his own story. He speaks of laughter, of small victories, of the courage to honor his own voice while acknowledging the power and influence of another. It is a delicate equilibrium, one he navigates with the slow wisdom of age, carrying the weight of memory without being crushed by it. Finally, he arrives at the moment of release, the culmination of decades of experience, memory, and reflection. Jeff Goldblum speaks not to accuse, not to vilify, but to illuminate the truth of a life intertwined with genius, the sacrifices exacted by proximity to brilliance, the heartbreaks and triumphs, the love lost and found, the lessons learned. In naming these truths, he finds clarity, dignity, and a fragile peace. The shadows of the past remain, but he has reclaimed his narrative, spoken his confessions, and embraced the complexity of life in Hollywood's dazzling yet demanding orbit. And as he leans back, letting the silence settle like a final note, there is a sense that, at last, he has unburdened himself, offering not only a story of fame and influence, but a testament to resilience, humanity, and the courage to confront the truth. And so, the story turns inward, settling into the quiet spaces where memory and emotion intertwine. Jeff Goldblum reflects on decades of life lived in the glare of Hollywood, a world of glimmering lights, whispered pressures, and the delicate dance between. Loss and mortality remain ever-present themes. Jeff speaks of friends and mentors who passed too soon, of hospital rooms where whispers replaced laughter, of grief both intimate and profound. Each encounter deepened his appreciation for the fragility of life, the fleeting nature of opportunity, and the profound importance of presence. These experiences etched lasting lessons into his psyche, that love, loyalty, and human connection are the true measures of life, far surpassing fame, accolades, or public recognition. Even in moments of sorrow, he finds clarity, a recognition that the weight of life is borne not alone, but alongside those we cherish. And yet, amid reflection, there is a persistent light, a fragile, enduring hope. Jeff recalls nights spent alone at the piano, improvising melodies that carried both sorrow and joy, letters written and never sent, moments of introspection and self-expression. These were the acts that sustained him, offering clarity, grounding, and the reclamation of his own narrative. Through them, he learned that even in the orbit of brilliance, one can find autonomy, preserve integrity, and create spaces for personal truth. It is a quiet triumph, a testament to resilience, creativity, and the human capacity for renewal. Finally, Jeff Goldblum speaks with the weight and clarity of one who has lived fully, loved deeply, and endured profoundly. He shares not only his experiences with Rob Reiner, but the private truths of a life spent navigating brilliance, fear, love, loss, and redemption. There is no accusation, no bitterness, only acknowledgement, reflection, and the quiet dignity of truth. He has reclaimed his story, confronted the shadows, and embraced the complexity of life in Hollywood's dazzling yet demanding orbit. And as the camera lingers, capturing the depth in his eyes, there is a sense that at last he has unburdened himself, off ring a story not only of fame and influence, but of resilience, humanity, and the courage to face the truth, however heavy it may be. Time seems to fold in on itself as Jeff Goldblum continues, his voice slower now, each word deliberate, weighted with decades of memory. He recalls evenings spent in quiet reflection, long after the glare of lights and applause had vanished. A walk along a fog-laden street in San Francisco, a solitary cab ride through the glittering cityscape of Los Angeles, hours spent in the warm dimness of a jazz club, piano notes spilling like secrets into the night. These were the moments where the full measure of his life, and of Rob Reiner's influence on it, became clear, not as accusation, not as bitterness, but as understanding. That genius carries gravity, and gravity shapes every orbit it touches, whether one wishes it or not. That he speaks of the subtle costs of that orbit. Relationships strained, friendships frayed, the delicate balance of loyalty and self-preservation. The personal toll is measured not in headlines, not in awards, but in quiet regrets. The laughter missed at a child's recital, the long conversations left unspoken, the tender touch delayed by obligations both visible and unseen. And yet, he also recognizes the enduring beauty in the struggle, the ability to persevere, to love despite absence, to navigate brilliance without losing oneself completely. It is a delicate, painful, yet profound understanding that has shaped the man he has become. There were confrontations that left deep impressions, moments when the weight of Reiner's expectations collided with his own instincts, forcing him to choose between submission and integrity. Jeff recounts these moments vividly, recalling the intensity, the fear, and the subtle power dynamics at play. And yet, through these trials, he discovered resilience, courage, and a capacity for quiet rebellion. He learned to assert his voice while honoring another's, to navigate Hollywood's complex terrain without surrendering the essence of who he is, and to carry the lessons of those encounters forward into a life lived with more awareness and care. Illness and mortality continue to punctuate his reflections. Jeff remembers friends taken too soon, colleagues lying in hospital beds, whispered last words, and the quiet grief that follows. These losses brought clarity, forcing him to reckon with what is truly meaningful: connection, presence, compassion, and honesty. Hollywood's glamour fades in these moments. What remains is the human heart, fragile yet resilient, capable of enduring loss while still finding hope. Each passing friend, each farewell, reminds him of the preciousness of time and the necessity of speaking truth before silence becomes permanent. In the midst of all this, he finds solace in small, intimate acts, playing the piano, wandering through quiet streets, writing notes never meant to be sent, sharing laughter and stories with loved ones. These moments, seemingly ordinary, are sacred. They offer grounding, clarity, and a reclamation of agency, a way to navigate the pressures of fame while remaining tethered to what is real, personal, and enduring. Through them, he discovers that even in proximity to genius, one can carve out spaces for authenticity, reflection, and emotional survival. And so, Jeff Goldblum, at 73, offers his confession, not a reckoning with Hollywood, not a condemnation of Rob Reiner, but an intimate, emotional acknowledgement of a life lived fully, complexly, and profoundly. He has named the costs, the sacrifices, the hidden truths, and the enduring lessons. In sharing them, he unburdens himself, honors the past, and affirms the human capacity for resilience, understanding, and hope. And as the camera lingers on his face, capturing the depth of years, the traces of joy and sorrow, the shadows and light, there's a quiet sense of closure, of reflection, and of the courage it takes to finally speak the truth. The final threads of memory come into focus as Jeff Goldblum leans back, letting the quiet of the room settle around him. He speaks now with a gentleness that only decades of reflection can bring, his voice carrying the cadence of both awe and sorrow. He recalls the earliest days of his career, when Hollywood seemed a kingdom of possibility and every encounter shimmered with promise. And yet, even then, the presence of Rob Reiner, magnetic, exacting, impossible to ignore, was a force that shaped the trajectory of his life. Not in overt ways, but in subtle, persistent currents. A word here, a look there, a decision that nudged the course of relationships, choices, and opportunities. Jeff's confession is no longer about anger. It is about understanding, a recognition that genius and influence often arrive intertwined, carrying consequences both beautiful and heavy. That he returns with vivid clarity to moments of private triumph and loss. The hospital rooms where he whispered final words to dying friends, the quiet nights at a piano improvising melodies that carried both sorrow and joy, the solitary walks through cities that never sleep. These are the textures of his existence, the hidden layers beneath the public persona. Each moment of grief, each fleeting victory, each tender act of love has shaped him in ways the world cannot see. He speaks of family with reverence, the children whose laughter anchors him, the partner whose patience has been unwavering, the quiet reconciliations that mend what was strained. In these bonds, he finds the balance to endure, to navigate the brilliance and shadows that age. Ave defined his career. Reiner's influence, while never absent, is reframed in this final reflection. Jeff acknowledges the brilliance, the lessons, the challenges, and even the fear that came with proximity to such a powerful figure. He recognizes the duality, that admiration and tension, fear and inspiration, loss and opportunity often coexist, shaping a life in ways subtle, enduring, and transformative. It is a testament not only to the cost of genius, but to the resilience required to live fully within its orbit, to honor one's own voice, and to emerge with integrity intact. Mortality, loss, and regret remain present, but Jeff's tone carries a measure of peace. He speaks of the friends who have passed, the silent ache of absence, the moments of reflection that have taught him the importance of presence, honesty, and connection. Hollywood's glimmer fades against these truths, revealing the raw humanity beneath. It is here, in these private, unobserved spaces, that the real story exists. A life interwoven with brilliance and challenge, loss and love, fear and courage, all leading to the fragile, luminous truth of being fully alive. Finally, at 73, Jeff Goldblum lays bare the tapestry of his life with courage and tenderness. The confessions, the regrets, the lessons, and the love converge in a quiet, powerful understanding. He has navigated brilliance without surrendering himself, endured hardship without bitterness, and found hope amidst shadow. And as the camera lingers, capturing the depth of years and the subtle grace of a man who has lived through both joy and pain, there's a profound sense of completion. A story told not for spectacle, but for truth, for understanding, and for the fragile beauty of life itself. The room is silent now, save for the soft hum of memory and the faint echo of decades lived in light and shadow. Jeff Goldblum sits, eyes distant yet luminous, carrying the weight of truth he has held for far too long. The story of his life, intertwined with Rob Reiner's brilliance and the quiet, unspoken costs of proximity to genius, stretches behind him like a long corridor. Moments of laughter and heartbreak, triumph and regret, love and loss, all etched into the very rhythm of his being. And yet, for the first time, he allows it to exist fully, without fear, without concealment. The conclusion is not a finale of blame, nor a tidy resolution. It is an acknowledgment of complexity. He speaks of the human heart, fragile yet resilient, capable of enduring both admiration and sorrow, both joy and grief. He speaks of family, whose patience and love have anchored him through decades of absence and challenge. He speaks of friends lost, of mentors revered, of colleagues tested and cherished. And he speaks of himself, not the public persona, not the star adored by millions, but the man who has lived, faltered, reflected, and endured. Jeff's confession is a quiet testament to survival, To navigate a world of brilliance without losing one's voice, to honor the lessons of the past while reclaiming the present, to carry regret with grace and hope with intention. These are the truths he now shares. Rob Reiner, in all his genius and intensity, is part of this story, as are countless others whose influence shaped, challenged, and at times shadowed his journey. But the story is also Jeff's, a narrative of courage, resilience, and the enduring capacity to embrace life's contradictions without surrendering to them. In the end, there is a delicate, almost imperceptible peace. The shadows remain, as shadows always do, but they no longer dominate the light. Jeff Goldblum has spoken, and in speaking, he has reclaimed not only his story, but a sense of clarity, dignity, and fragile freedom. The audience, privy to his truths, witnesses a man who has lived fully, loved deeply, and endured profoundly. A man who has faced the costs of brilliance and emerged with his humanity intact. And as the camera lingers on his quiet, reflective gaze, the final note settles. Life, in all its complexity, is both beautiful and heavy, and the courage to speak the truth, even decades later, is its own quiet, enduring triumph. The confession ends. The truth remains. The story lives.